Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for being with us today. My name's Sarah Barclay. I'm one of the directors of the Medical Mediation Foundation. We set up back in 2010 to provide a place for mediating between families, patients and health professionals, and in providing training in recognising and managing conflict for health professionals, which as the years have gone by has seemed to be increasingly irrelevant given the pressures and the stresses that professionals are working under. We've worked mainly in paediatrics, but we've extended now and working with adult medical teams and social care teams. And we've tried to make sure that everything that we do is evidence-based. So we've published a lot of evaluated research on the impact of our work, and have started working internationally too with teams in Australia and New Zealand. One of our current focuses is a project funded by a charity called True Colours, where we're working to embed a framework that we've created for managing conflict as a healthcare team into 3 children's hospitals. So we'll evaluate that, and if it's successful, we'll hopefully provide something of a blueprint for hospitals and medical teams to work with to support them when those conflicts arise. So it's lovely to be here today, and I'd like to introduce my fellow director, Oscar.
Yeah, hi everybody. Very nice to be here with you today. So I'm a director of MMF with Sarah. My background is legal rather than medical, so I was a barrister specialising in healthcare law, and got into this work through working as a prosecutor for the General Medical Council. So I set up a pilot mediation programme for them a few years ago now, and one of the things that struck me working in this area is that it didn't matter how senior you were, it didn't matter whether or not you actually done anything wrong. There was an enormous weight on people going through these, when complaints were made and they got into tangles with one another at work. And at the kernel of most things that crossed my desk was some form of communication breakdown. And so I started working with Sarah about 6 years ago now, and now we do this work, we mediate, we train, and we do webinars like this. So very nice to be here with you all. And I would like to introduce in turn Gaynor.
Hello everybody, my name is Gaynor Whiter. I'm one of the medical legal advisors at the MDU, and I've been here since 2011, so it's coming up to 11 years now. Prior to that, I qualified in 1989, and then was following an anaesthetic training, but decided to re-qualify as a solicitor, and provided legal advice for some years prior to joining the MDU. And I'm delighted to be here. Clearly, the pandemic has had a number of fallouts in relation to patient and doctor burnouts, and I'm looking forward to being in this webinar with you all.
Lovely, thank you very much, Gaynor. To start with, just some introductions at admin side of things. We're going to be using Mentimeter today. I imagine most of you, having lived and worked through a pandemic, will be familiar with Mentimeter. You need to go to menti.com on a browser window or on your phone. Phone's often easiest, and enter the code there, because we're going to be doing a little bit of interactive stuff as we go. Please do ask questions as we go. If you go to the right hand side of your screen, you should see a question mark box that will allow you to ask questions of us as we go. We're going to have 20 minutes at the end to answer specific questions that come in, but please do keep them coming as we go, and we'll keep an eye out for them. You're going to get an attendance certificate, and that'll come out in the next few days. And the MDU are recording this because they want to put it on the website, but recording us rather than you, just so you know that. So in terms of what we're going to be looking at over the course of the next 55 minutes, we're going to start by looking at ourselves in conflict, what being in conflict does to us as individuals, and especially as professionals, perhaps. We're then going to look at the recognizing the warning signs of conflict, how we engage with others to avoid conflict, and then we're going to tell you a little bit about mediation, and then, as I said, the 20 minutes Q&A with us at the end to answer any questions that you've got. Sarah.
Thank you, Oscar. So we wanted to start with this quote, which we often use in our training because it seems very relevant to the territory we're going to be talking about today. It comes from Atul Gawande, who's an American surgeon and writer of many books on the human factors in medicine, and particularly around the factors which can increase clinical risk. And he says, I'm in a profession which has succeeded because of its ability to fix. If your problem is fixable, we know just what to do. But if it's not, and conflict really takes us into that unfixable zone. Health professionals have often said to us that they feel more comfortable when they're able to give information, provide diagnoses, tell patients what to do. But what happens when they're confronted with really high-end emotion, disagreements over treatment, emotions that have an impact on the health professionals and make them feel as if they're under attack? So what we're going to be thinking about today is really how we approach, name, and start to think about managing those situations. What's going on when conflict arises? Because conflict takes us out of that zone. And I think when lockdown began, we were all in that unfixable zone. And of course, the dynamic has changed to some extent now, but actually although we haven't got that public outpouring of gratitude that we saw right at the beginning, it's been replaced by burnout, by distress, by, as we've seen from the recent MDU survey, doctors saying that they are exhausted and frightened about the potential impact on clinical risk. So we are going to be thinking about what sort of strategies we might need to pull out of ourselves, pull out of our toolbox in order to try and work with that.
Thank you, Sarah. I can see lots of people in the chat asking for the code. The code will pop up every time you're asked to do something, so you should see it now. So the first thing, we want to ask you a couple of questions to start this off, get your responses to it. We wondered, what impact has the pandemic had on your relationships with your colleagues, to start with? And you can see the Mentimeter code there at the top of the screen. I'll read it out loud as well. It's 50736185. So as you plug your responses into that, they should be coming up with this. And with this word cloud, the more a certain word is entered, the larger it will be, or more prominent it will be in the cloud. And as we've seen, as we've asked this question in previous sessions, it's a complicated answer, isn't it? Distant and closer being two of the first ones that popped up there, strained and improved. Sarah, what are your thoughts looking at it?
It's hugely complicated, isn't it? And we've got a lot of people with us today, and I think what we've got here gives us such a powerful picture of the complexity of those emotions and the impact that the pandemic has had. So as you said, there are a lot of contradictory ones in there, but equally we've got challenging and supportive. So there has been a lot of bonding, but we're seeing the exhaustion in there, the worry, the anxiety. So a real mixed bag. And I think it's important to acknowledge the complexity of it too.
Yes, I think that one of the issues is depending upon what you've been doing during the pandemic may really affect how you feel as a doctor in your relationships with others. If you've been particularly busy and you've had a very supportive environment, clearly it's going to be a better way to get through. But I know that lots of doctors haven't had that support, and that's reflected here in the mixed views.
Mm. And something that I've seen, I spend most of my time working with clinical teams, groups of consultants. It hasn't been a linear journey. I mean, we started off and people really pulled together. You could really see kind of fractures that I had seen in teams heal overnight. But then as time goes on, things change and things reappear or come out in different ways. So it has been complicated. Thank you very much, everybody. Same question, really. but about your patients. What impact has the pandemic had on your relationship with your patients, would you say? And for those of you, just to say, who are struggling with the tech, what you need to do is go to menti.com, so that's menti.com, and enter the code that's at the top of the screen. That's 50736185. And please do keep your questions coming in. I've spied some really interesting ones already. And you'll all be able to see the screen at the moment, and you'll be forming your own responses to this. But for me, looking at the word cloud that's appearing, it's similar complexity and, you know, strained, distant, but also closer came up very quickly. Sarah, over to you again. Anything that you can see?
I think we've often heard as well that there are many instances where actually doctors and patients feel that they are in the same boat, that they're all struggling with exactly the same pressures, and so there's a shared frustration about what everyone's having to manage. We also know, of course, that on the other side of that, there's a huge amount of frustration and anger being directed at health professionals, particularly at GPs, and the whole business of online consultations versus face-to-face. And so those are the things often that have fractured those previously good relationships, and I think there will be quite a lot to recover from as we go forward, a lot of rebuilding of trust and confidence, and as the health professionals try to manage that workload and the frustration, I think there's a lot of work to be done on rebuilding that ground and connection.
Thank you very much. Finally, our last Mentimeter here. When you've encountered conflict on either side of that, so with colleagues or with patients, what have tended to be the sources of that conflict for you? There's a lot there, isn't there? Gaynor, what do you make of the picture evolving in front of you?
Well, I think as is coming out from some of the questions that are being asked, I think there was a huge amount of goodwill at the beginning of the pandemic, and in the last 2 years that's become eroded as doctors are burnt out and patients are frustrated, and so therefore things are really coming to a head, and I think that has been seen really quite well reflected in what we get asked to assist with. So I think that is really the crux of it.
It's interesting, isn't it, or at least from my perspective, that communication in its various different ways is coming through centrally there, that some of this is particular to the pandemic, so having to do everything over video, for example, masks, etc. But communication breakdown, poor communication is, as it was pre-pandemic, kind of pretty central to when conflict occurs. Thank you very much, Gaynor. Gaynor, you were going to take us through your what you're seeing from your MDU perspective.
Yes, so I thought I would just start with a brief review of what we've been seeing in the last years, and there are two issues. There's the colleague conflict and there's the patient conflict. And I think I'll start with the colleague conflict first, because that seems to be what most of our questions are at the moment. So I think one of the big things that we found right at the beginning was that there were very different reactions to COVID-19 from different physicians and surgeons. So some doctors were personally very afraid because of their own conditions, their own medical health, but others weren't. And it wasn't necessarily that the doctors with the diabetes and the hypertension would be the ones who were wanting to shield. Sometimes it would be the triathletes with asthma who would then get very afraid. And so that engendered quite a bit of resentment, and we saw that in our advice line calls and also in our advice files. So at the same time, some clinicians were dying, and that increased all the fear. So that meant that people were quite reluctant sometimes to come in if they felt that they needed to shield, and that created some difficulties with staffing. There were also difficulties initially in accessing, for example, PPE and deciding how to discharge and admit patients. And the COVID rules changed day by day almost, and so it made it very difficult to provide a safe service, and anyway, what would be safe, and all of that increased the conflicts that we seem to see. So, you know, initially there were 14 days of isolation if you were away, then there were 10, now there are 7, and some specialties were overwhelmed, the respiratory and ICU specialties were overwhelmed, whereas others were extremely quiet. So, you know, anecdotally, patients in some cancer wards, you know, there were only 2 or 3 of them, and they were getting extremely attentive care from the nurses, but other wards would be completely and utterly full. So we saw that there was quite a lot of questions about staff redeployment. So, for example, I had one advice line call where the doctor was in orthopedics and had been asked to go and work in obstetrics where there wouldn't be any senior care, and said that they hadn't actually done any obstetrics since their medical school days, and so we're finding it very difficult, and a lot of people had fear. And then we found that the changes in practice made way for different types of consultations. So telephone consultations came into play, and not just in GP surgeries, but in all sorts of different hospital specialties, and that created difficulties. For example, I would speak to physicians who said, well, I want to do these types of investigations. I've been told by management I'm not able to because they can't actually help with the access of patients to hospital, and I don't think I'm providing safe care because if I don't do these, I think I'm going to miss that. So that made it, you know, very difficult, I think, and it's still quite difficult, I think, for doctors who are trying very hard, I think, to reinvent practice to work around the COVID difficulties. So I think that the outcome of all this has been that doctors feel that it's all never ending. They feel it's all embracing, it's extending to their personal life. Junior doctors have said that they've been told they're not allowed to socialise in case one of them gets COVID. I've had people in tears on the phone because they said they had 7 people in their house instead of 6, and they were going to be investigated, and they hadn't realised that their 7th person had turned up. And it all seems to be never ending. It's very difficult to firefight when there's no end in sight, and everyone is tired and stressed. And that's come out in our surveys, because even as early as May 2021, the majority of doctors felt that they had a poor work-life balance. I think that's probably been the same for quite some time, but it's become poorer. Nearly half said they would perform their role despite feeling unwell, so they feel pressurized to come in, pressurized to be there when they weren't well, and 73% felt that their stress levels were worse than at the beginning of the pandemic. And as you may be aware, we've just had another survey, which was of 532 MDU members who said, and it was only this week, that 25% of them felt tiredness was affecting their care. 1 in 3 got no breaks whilst working. That's not unusual, even prior to the pandemic, but I think it's probably worse now. And then 1 in 5 didn't have any area to go to, even if they were able to have a break, which was away from the ward environment. So that's what we've been seeing with colleagues and doctors. But there's the flip side of it is with patients. And from their point of view, it would seem at the beginning of the pandemic, things were very quiet. There weren't patient complaints, no patient complaints were being particularly investigated. But it was a very quiet time because patients were waiting to see what was happening, and they weren't coming in for routine operations. The access to urgent services was even poor, so the rapid access clinics weren't necessarily working. And when they did recommence, there were often telephone consultations, which have since led to patient complaints that the care is being compromised because they're not being, as they see it, examined. So there have been long waiting times for routine referrals already and cancellations, and that is meaning that all of the elective surgery is going back and back and back, and patients are becoming frustrated, and that initial goodwill is eroding. The other things that we found were that patients were complaining that there wasn't any family contact allowed when their loved ones were in hospital, and so, for example, fathers-to-be couldn't go in initially when their wives were in labour or the partners were in labour, and then there were complaints that even though they were asking for updates, the hospital contact was not sufficient, presumably because they were all working extremely hard, but I think other patient families felt very frustrated that they didn't have any impact on patient care or any knowledge of it, and there were a number of patients who died without anyone being able to see them or know what was going on. So, so we've had a lot of complaints, and they seem to be now that doctors are inaccessible or lazy. There's a Daily Mail campaign out, and there are various complaints, but those that feature highly are a delay in diagnosis and a failure to examine or have face-to-face consultations in both the hospital and the GP environment, increased waiting times for everything, both for an operation or to see a GP, increased morbidity and mortality as a result of those alleged delays, and a failure also to provide safe spaces in hospitals or surgeries. So you have some patients who won't come in because it's too unsafe, and then you have other patients who want to come in and are unable to do so, and so you can't really win as a health professional. Certainly our members do fear complaints. Back in February 2021, 67% of doctors surveyed feared a complaint, and around 40% had abuse from their patients. And between March 2020 and February 2021, which is quite some time ago now, and we've had a great deal more since, but there have been 3,500 MDU complaints at that time over that period. So they're a great number. We've also had problems with vaccination disputes with family members where the patient lacks capacity, so can't make their own decision. We've had a lot of queries about vaccination exemption certificates, and the criteria for having those are very slim, but patients feel that they're being discriminated against if they don't get them, and both GPs and hospital doctors are involved in that, because when the GP doesn't know about a particular problem, they'll ask the hospital specialist. So all of this has just increased the work of all of our members, and I think we're seeing that in record numbers of requests for assistance, for complaints, but also for other things which have arisen in the last couple of years.
Thank you very much, Gaynor. Such an interesting picture, isn't it? And I'm sure people have lots of questions about that. So everybody, please do put questions about what Gaynor said in the question box, and we'll come to those at the end of the session. From here, we're going to look at understanding ourselves in conflict, and this material is a snapshot of what Sarah and I do on the 2 sessions that we run for the MDU, which is a session focused on conflict, building better relationships with your colleagues, and a session focused on building better relationships between patients and doctors. So another Mentimeter for you, please. What we'd like you to do is think back to a time you were involved in a conflict or a disagreement or a tension with a colleague or a patient in the workplace. And what we're interested in is not the story, although they're often very interesting, but it's the impact on you. So what did you feel? What did it feel like to be in that conflict? You can plug that into the Mentimeter. Let's see what comes up. This is a question that we often ask in these webinars, and the thing that always strikes me is the depth of feeling that conflict invokes in people. When you as an individual and you as a professional find yourself in conflict, very kind of deep responses. Just to grab a few of them off the page: fear, anger, dread, distress. Sarah, what are your
really powerful emotions? And as we're going to see in a moment, it's actually when we start to unpick those emotions and really think, well, they're being felt on all sides. It's not surprising that conflict starts to flare. And I'm just let people put in a few more words, but I hope the next slide will be helpful just in helping us to think about what's going on in ourselves and what's going on, what are we seeing when conflict flares up in front of us. So we use, it's called the PIN model, and we use it a lot in mediation and in our teaching, because for us it's a really powerful visual model of what we're seeing in conflict. So we've got the tip of the iceberg here, where we're seeing the really strong emotions and behaviors that we see in conflict. So anger or aggression, frustration. And of course, they're not just being felt on one side, they're often felt by the professionals as much as they may be felt by the patients. But what's going on beneath the surface is the stuff that's really difficult to get to. The feelings and interests people have. What is it that needs to happen in order to help them feel heard, in order for them to resolve the situation that they're in? And right at the bottom there, those fundamental human needs, which are, for those of you familiar with the Maslow hierarchy of needs, those are needs that we all share, human needs. But when we're in conflict, that's not what we're seeing. Often conflict escalates because we engage just with what's on the surface. So we have, if you like, a lot of clashing icebergs. We're not going to get at what lies underneath and be able to unpick actually what are the things that we share, what are the things that we might be able to work through, reach a compromise on, what are the things that unite us. So what can be really helpful in conflict situations is to try and take that momentary step back and think that what you're seeing on the surface may actually be very, very different to what's going on underneath. So you may see anger on the top. Underneath there may be fear, distress, loneliness, all sorts of other really powerful emotions. When we mediate, that's what we're trying to help parties in conflict to be able to share with each other. And I wanted briefly to show you a a pathway for conflict escalation that we devised from research actually done with parents and families and professionals working in the paediatric sector, but very resonant for really all areas of healthcare. And we conducted a number of in-depth interviews with people who'd been directly involved in conflict to try and see whether there were any common themes and whether there was a pattern of escalation. So we divided it into in the paper we published, it's sort of mild, moderate and severe phases of conflict. But we hope this traffic light zone will make it a little bit more accessible. And in this first zone, we really focus on the triggers for conflict. And in our training, we're trying to get enhanced sort of spotting of what those triggers are at an early stage so that we can stop conflict from escalating. So things like insensitive use of language, getting people's names wrong. We know that a lot of people in paediatrics absolutely hate being referred to as mum or dad. That can be a real source of conflict. Conflicting messages, mixed messages from professionals, which are very hard to avoid sometimes, but which we know from experience are real triggers for conflict. Making assumptions, for example, that this family or this patient is difficult in and of themselves, rather than it being the situation that they're in that is making them behave in ways that professionals are finding really challenging and difficult. And so often there's a backstory. Something's happened to dent trust and confidence in health professionals in general. It may not be about you, but it's about health professionals in general. And once we understand what's going on, what the backstory is, it can really help to build trust and engagement. If we move up the scale into our amber zone, I've often called this the kind of elephant in the room zone, because we're often seeing behaviours which everybody is aware of. Everyone has that sense that it's beginning to feel a bit like a battleground. People start to avoid each other. Conflict avoidance is very, very widely seen and understandable. Conflict feels really challenging and difficult. It's not surprising we want to avoid it rather than recognise it, acknowledge it, name it and manage it, which is the thing that we really want to aim at in all of the work that we do. And we often see those very controlling behaviours, micromanaging we've called it, which is really are often behaviours which are coming from a place of being out of control, but trying to exert and impose control, whether it's from being super vigilant about which professional looks after you, what time medications have been given in hospital settings, standing over professionals, perhaps while cannulas are being inserted. So this is a zone where we really want to see and note and acknowledge the behaviours we're seeing and try and think about what we need to do to manage them in order to get us back to the green zone rather than on into the red zone, which we're going to look at finally, the sort of real extreme consequences of conflict, where from the analysis that was done of our interviews, there was a real sense at this stage in conflict that somehow the patient, or if it was in paediatrics, the child, had got lost in the middle of the conflict. And the focus might be in paediatrics on the parents, or with the patient, the real focus on their care and well-being had somehow got lost in the mix of the conflict, so that conflict is taking on a life of its own, was a phrase which many of our interviewees used. And at the extreme end, physical and verbal threats and attack. And we know that people have different thresholds and will need to take different actions. We're not asking people to use their best conflict resolution skills if they're feeling under threat, but of course, where you are in your healthcare setting will make a difference to what your response is to that. What we've tried to do, just to finish this section, in thinking about conflict in this way and being able to recognise its stages, is that we've wanted to put a sort of vocabulary around conflict, because unless we have that vocabulary, unless we know what those warning signs are, it's very difficult to have a shared acknowledgement that conflict has arisen and we need to think what we're going to do to manage it. So that's a real whistle-stop tour through, but I hope that gives you a sense, and we'll talk a lot more about that in our in the training day that we do on conflict with patients, to unpick some of the examples of what we might be seeing at each of those stages.
Thank you, Sarah. So what do you do with that? How do you find a way through it? And in this section, I wanted to share with you some of the concepts that we use when we're trying to find a way through that conflict, either to stop it escalating in the first place, or if you're in it, if you're up towards that severe end, what can you do to try and improve things? There's a quote that we use, which is from Maya Angelou, who you may well be familiar with, the US-based poet who died a few years ago now. But this is really resonant in our work, I think. So she said, "I've learned that people will forget what you've said and people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." And that's a core concept in conflict resolution, that if you're going to go into conflict resolution, if you're going to try and make things better, you need to get into the feelings, because this is about people's emotional narratives and their emotional landscapes. So it's a feelings business. A Mentimeter for you. Is conflict fundamentally about someone being right and someone being wrong? Do you think, would you say? So 2 at the moment in the yes column, 39 in the no column by my screen. I imagine people might have been swayed by the degree in one column or the other. Normally when we ask this question, it skews one way, but not quite that much. Well, one of the key concepts that we work with, and this is all from the Harvard Negotiation Project, is that conflict isn't about who's right and who's wrong. Often, almost, I might say always, when we find ourselves in conflict, we feel like we're on the side of justice, that we've got it right and that the other person is being unreasonable, and that it is a question of right versus wrong when we're in it. But Harvard says it's much more complicated than that. And what conflict is about is a complex and rather messy interplay between values, histories, perceptions, what we see versus what the other person sees. And it can go really deep. It can go into childhood experiences, how it's been at school, your relationship with your family. And because we all come to the place that we're at having had different experiences, and you have to take that into account when you're thinking about conflict. And that can be quite a challenging idea to people. I like to think of this guy as a kind of frustrated service manager, because there are situations where you are right. You are technically right. But the reason that we try and encourage people to get away from that is that you can be technically correct and completely stuck. And if a person gets invested in being right about something, you're stuck in that wrestling match and you're not flexible to a different outcome. So it's about, you can be right and stuck. So it's about moving beyond right and wrong and thinking about things in terms of viewpoints and perspectives. This is the concept that we use quite a lot in the colleagues course. And this is again from the Harvard Negotiation Project. And I think for my money, this is possibly the most important concept that I work with in conflict resolution. And that's the idea that we make assumptions about intent based upon what we see and its impact on us. So the idea is that we are aware of our own intentions and other people's impact on us, but we're blind to, because we can't see other people's intentions or our impact on them. And what happens when relationships break down is that people project into that right-hand column what they fear might be there. So this is something that we see day in, day out in mediation. People saying that the other person is dishonest or lying or vindictive, and we'll go and see the other person and they'll say the other thing of that person who said it in the first place, that both people start to adopt that position. So the reason that we don't get anywhere when we find ourselves in conflict is we think we're right and that the other person is the issue, the other person is the problem. And believe it or not, they also think that. They think that they're right and that we're being the problem, we're the one being obstructive. And so boiling it down, the key thing here is that neither person's conclusion makes sense to the other person. That's the territory that we're dealing in here. And then finally, again from Harvard, it's a really nice concept that stays with me, that engaging in solving conflicts without talking about feelings is like staging an opera without music. And you'll get the plot, but you'll miss the point. So you've got to get down below the surface of that iceberg into the feelings and issues territory if you're going to make things if you're going to move things forward. The conflict is inevitable. You're going to find it in your work as doctors, but what you do with it is optional. So that's the kind of thing we teach you in the courses, is about what you can do when you find yourself there. Thank you. I want to touch on mediation now as a concept topic.
Yes, the last thing we just wanted to give you a snapshot of, but again, we'll look at this in much more depth and do some practice in the courses that we run. When do you call for a mediator and what do we do? One of the most difficult aspects of conflict is to acknowledge that it's almost impossible to mediate your own conflict just because of the impact that it has. Yet health professionals believe that they should be able to resolve things because they're good communicators and that it's part of their role to resolve differences of opinion. Sometimes that just isn't possible. We often get asked to mediate at a point where conflict has been going on for a very long time. We also want to say that we recognize that it requires a lot of courage and bravery to say, actually, we need help in resolving this situation. Some impartial, neutral expertise will be very valuable. So just to give you a very brief idea of what mediation is, it's a flexible process. That's really important. It is confidential. It's voluntary. Nobody ever gets forced into mediating if they don't want to. What we do is to facilitate conversations which might not otherwise be possible. That's, I think, the simplest way of saying it. And we are not there to come up with solutions. We're there to listen. We're not there to arbitrate. Our role is to support others in trying to reach resolution themselves. It's also legally privileged, which is important to say that nothing which is said during a mediation can be used in subsequent litigation. So that the purpose of mediation is to really allow a space for things to be said which might not, and for apologies to be given, for example, which it might not have been possible to say in other more formal settings. So finally, I think just to say, when might you consider bringing in a mediator? So the first and perhaps obvious one, when parties cannot reach agreement for whatever reason that might be, or when communication has broken down and positions have become really entrenched, as we've seen in that amber zone of the pathway. And thirdly, really importantly, when people think that their voices are not being listened to or being acknowledged, and that there's a real sense of people feeling that an injustice has taken place. Mediation can be a space where you are able to unlock and unpack some of that in a safe and supported way. So when we look at our training course for patients, what we're trying to do is to amplify a lot of what we've been talking about, give you a lot of practice in working with some of those key mediation skills. And our next Conflict with Patients course is on the 3rd of February. And I think Oscar, yes, thank you, Oscar. The next Conflict with Colleagues course is on the 10th of February. I think that one is now pretty much fully sold out, but I think there are a few places still left for the Conflict between Doctors and Patients course in a couple of weeks' time.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Sarah. And you'll have our contact details there as well. So we've got 15 minutes now to answer any questions that you've got about any of that or the conflict that you see in your work more generally. Thank you for those of you who've put questions in the question boxes already. And there's one that's jumped out to get us started, I think probably one for Sarah to start with, which is, how do you deal with patients or a family if they're threatening to complain if something isn't done? That's juicy one to get us started.
Yes, thank you, Oscar. I think, although it may be hard to say this, the first thing that needs to happen is to try and stand back from what you might, the fear and the frustration and the anger you might feel about the fact that patients are threatening to make a complaint, and to try and have a conversation which allows space and time to explore where they're at, what their perspective is, what has been going on for them. So it's an exploratory conversation. Of course, patients have an absolute right to complain if they want to, but often the reason they complain is because they haven't felt heard, or because they feel it's a last resort because they have tried to ask for things, they've tried to do things which haven't happened, or of course because something genuinely has gone wrong. So I would say that the very first step, at least along that pathway, is to try and have a conversation to try and find out what has happened and what the patient or parent sees, what is most important to them in trying to find a way through it. Because everybody knows that when their complaint lands on their desk, a feeling of dread, not understandably as the first impact, but actually to be able to stand back from that and sit down and talk can be really effective.
And one of the things that we see is that patients and doctors become sort of inextricably in conflict, and sometimes a second opinion or another colleague coming in to provide a further consultation with that patient can really help. And I'm looking at one of the questions here where one of our audience members is saying that right and wrong, yes, that can be the case at times, but if there's an issue of patient safety and harm, then you can't do what the patient wants. And the GMC is very clear on this. Doctors must not provide care which they feel would impact on patient safety or would not be suitable for their patient. They can ask for a second opinion in this particular case, and that's often helpful. But doctors can't be forced and shouldn't be forced to provide treatment which is not in a patient's best interests. And this can be the case with children especially, but it's also the case for any adult with capacity, or indeed family members wanting patients who have incapacity to be treated in a particular way. So yes, absolutely. If there is something which is going to cause harm, we wouldn't be advocating that you provide treatment, and indeed the GMC wouldn't be, but it would be a way of seeing through whether you could mediate a compromise which was suitable for the patient and acceptable.
Thanks, Gaynor.
I was going to say, sorry, I was going to say, could I dive in and answer very quickly the question about can I elaborate on why in paediatrics complaints are received about being called mum and dad? Okay. The reason, and I can answer quite, the reason is because it feels completely impersonal. Now, for some parents, they are fine with it. For other parents, particularly for parents who are well known in the mediation, in the hospital setting, it can feel as if there's a real lack of connection. There have been papers written on this in the BMJ by parents saying, please don't call me mum. If you call somebody by their name or ask them what they want to be called, or ask them if they are Sam or Fred's mum, actually that makes a huge difference, because they want to be connected with the person rather than a generic parent. So it's about building trust and connection, and we know that it can be really a trigger for conflict for some parents to be consistently called mum or dad.
Thanks, Sarah. One that I might have a go at, how successful is mediation in a chronic conflict between work colleagues? I spend most of my side of this is working with colleague to colleague conflict. Mediation isn't a panacea, and generally speaking, the longer a conflict has gone on, the more entrenched people have got. It's not uncommon, in fact, I'd almost say it's usual for people to have been in conflict for years, if not decades. I often work with people who have been in conflict for decades. And chronic conflict is extremely hard to engage with. One of the kind of, I suppose, truisms of conflict resolution is that it's not something you can do to someone. So it requires both people to want to, at some level, walk out of a different door than the one they walked in, if that makes sense. And it can be transformative, it can repair relationships, and it can make people be able to walk, forward in their relationship at work in a completely different way. And it also cannot work sometimes. But when it does work, it normally works because people are faced with quite a binary choice, which is, after doing all of this, do we want to go back to the way things were, or do we want to choose to do it differently? And if you remember that big word cloud that came out when we looked at how people feel when they're in conflict, almost always people do not want to be there, and it's causing them extreme pain. They see the world very differently. They see the cause of that pain very differently, but they're both in that state of pain and don't want to be in it. So when it works, it's because people want to get themselves out of that. But you don't resolve the conflict as a mediator. You just hold the space for people to get there. Shall I put another one before us? Any tips on dealing with friction in an extremely large team of staff, which changes every single day, i.e. consultants and nurse practitioners different most days? I'm picking out the hard ones. Who would like to have a go at that?
I can have a go at this one. I think, again, if you've got an extremely large team which is dysfunctional, you need to get them together. I think if there is consensus between a number of individuals in that team, that needs to be put to the other members of the team or the management to try and resolve differences, because what you don't want is a team which keeps changing decisions, because that doesn't help anyone and certainly isn't very good for patient safety. If there are concerns, there are procedures to raise concerns within each trust, and even to the GMC if everything else fails, in particular patient safety issues. But in an organisation where you have a very large team, there's bound to be times when different people have different opinions, and the best thing to do, if you can, is get them together. If you can't, of course, that makes it more difficult, and then perhaps you do need to sit around the table and discuss things with somebody independent. It's not a panacea. It's a very difficult issue, and it is one that we see, and I'm afraid there's no easy answer that I can give.
Yeah, I concur again. Sarah, how is someone to deal with I think this is supposed to be unrealistic expectations from patients?
I had just highlighted exactly that one. So, of course, well, two things, I suppose. One person's unrealistic expectation is another person's very realistic, understandable expectation. So again, there are two sides to that story. I think we have to be really honest about what is a genuinely impossible expectation. So, for example, that you are going to have the same nurse looking after your child, or the same nurse or the same team of nurses looking after you every single day. That needs to be managed in a quite a firm but compassionate way, I think, so that people know that all the professionals who are looking after you are qualified to the same degree. But I think sometimes we get into conflict where there are issues around communication, particularly, and somebody might like working with a particular nurse because of the way they communicate. So it's really important to understand what it is that has made a family or a patient demand that they have certain people looking after them. Unreal or impossible expectations. I think we can all think during the pandemic that actually the expectation or the wish to be seen face to face is one of those things which it's been impossible to achieve at times, and to acknowledge how difficult that is for both the doctors and the patients. So sometimes when the dealing of those can be about sitting down and exploring. It can be about acknowledging the frustration that there is on the part of the patient or the family, real genuine frustration which may be shared by the professional as well. And sometimes if what is being asked is not possible to deliver, I think we have to be honest about that as well, but also allow space for the patient to say what that feels like, to be told that what they want is not achievable and not possible. So acknowledging the emotion is really important there too.
Thank you, Sarah. One which may speak to the conflict framework here. If a patient is threatening to complain, I feel bad about directing them to another colleague. It feels a bit like you're dumping them on the other person. How best to approach this?
Yes, I mean, I see members who ring and write in quite a bit, saying that they are at the end of their tether with a patient, and another person is going to be assigned, and they may feel that, you know, they have failed somehow in not being able to deal with it. But actually, I think that if there is a patient with whom you are having a difficulty, it may be that that other consultant or the other practitioner doesn't, because communication styles are different, and some people resonate better with others. So they will be similarly referring things back to you. So it's a quid pro quo, really. And I think he would be explaining exactly what it is that had happened and what your thoughts were, and making sure that they were aware of what they were coming to. But their experience might be very different from yours, and can be, because people are different.
Well, one of the things that we see when you have, say, in inverted commas, a difficult parent, is that people will go and have their own experience of that, come out and think, phew, that's me done now. And then everybody else will have the same experience. And one of the things we try and get people to do is treat challenging situations on a team basis. So to make sure there's a dialogue, a constructive dialogue about how you as a group are going to engage with an individual person. So it's not so much just passing the baton for the next person to go in and have a really hard time. It's about thinking about, as a group, how do you best manage this?
And we have a question about it being very time consuming. And yes, it can be very time consuming, but it's going to be even more time consuming if it's not sorted out. So sometimes it does take time, but I appreciate that you don't have time, and that it's not always easy to achieve what you need to in the time that you've got.
Sometimes I think it can be just, it can be, you can achieve a lot more in less time as well. So sometimes, and not always, it's about how you have the conversation, and actually it can make somebody feel that they have really been listened to and really been heard in a very short space of time. So it's surprising how sometimes just changing the structure of a conversation can make a difference. But I know, we all know that time is the commodity we all want more of.
One question that I've seen is there a time when complaints are not investigated? There is regulation, the statute, which underlies patient complaints, and if there are patient complaints in the NHS which are written, they need to be responded to. But if there are vexatious complaints, for example, things keep getting repeated, then no, you don't need to keep responding. And we have quite a few cases where very challenging situations have been found, and one doesn't need to keep responding. But if it is a patient complaint or a complaint about NHS care of any sort, then yes, if it's in writing, it will need to be initially responded to.
Thanks. Sarah, how do you train to become a mediator?
There are lots of different organisations that train people to become mediators. We only train people who work as health professionals in paediatrics, but we do have our own training course for that. It really depends. Most of the generic mediation training courses are aimed at either civil mediation or workplace mediation. Probably you want to look for a mediation training course which is based around workplace mediation, I would think would be most appropriate for the kind of the situations that we have been talking about today. So that would be what I would look for, and you can Google that and find a lot of different organisations that do that. One which is good, and I'll probably be slapped over the wrist for recommending one, but I know them personally, is an organisation called Consensio, and they do a lot of workplace mediation and training for workplace mediators too.
And Sarah, just finally, there are a few different requests in the chat for the references that we've talked about from the research that the organisation has done, and I imagine they can come out to you in an email when you get your other stuff, your attendance certificate.
Yes, I was going to. We'll give the reference to the paper. Some of them are open access, some not. but I'll let the MDU team know, and perhaps they would be kind enough to put them in the email that goes out. Otherwise, if you want to have a look on our website, you'll be able to download PDFs of our research from there.
Fantastic.
And in respect of the MDU surveys, they're all on our website, so you can access them there.
Wonderful. Well, it's 2 o'clock. Thank you very much, everybody, for all of your time and your engagement. Hopefully see you on one of our substantive courses. But apart from that, this is the end of the session. Thank you very much. So goodbye from me.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you so much for being here.
Goodbye from me.